35mm film is the film gauge most commonly used for motion pictures and chemical still photography. The name of the gauge refers to the width of the photographic film, which consists of strips 34.98 AA plus or minus 0.03 mm wide. The standard negative pull-down for movies is 4 perforations per frame along both edges, which results in 16 frames per foot of film. For still photography, the standard frame has 8 perforations on each side. A variety of largely proprietary gauges were devised for the numerous camera and projection systems being developed independently in the late 19th century and early 20th century, ranging from 13 mm to 75 mm, as well as a variety of film feeding systems. This resulted in cameras, projectors, and other equipment having to be calibrated to each gauge. The 35 mm width, originally specified as 1.375 inches, was introduced in 1892 by William Dixon and Thomas Edison, using film stock supplied by George Eastman. Film 35 mm wide with 4 perforations per frame became accepted as the international standard gauge in 1909, and has remained by far the dominant film gauge for image origination and projection despite challenges from smaller and larger gauges, and from novel formats, because its size allowed for a relatively good trade-off between the cost of the film stock and the quality of the images captured. The gauge has been versatile in application. It has been modified to include sound, redesigned to create a safer film base, formulated to capture color, has accommodated a bevy of widescreen formats, and has incorporated digital sound data into nearly all of its non-frame areas. Since the mid-1990s, Eastman Kodak and Fujifilm have held a duopoly in the manufacture of 35mm motion picture negative film. However, print film continues to be offered for sale by Agfa Javert. The ubiquity of 35mm movie projectors in commercial movie theaters made it the only motion picture format, film or video, that could be played in almost any cinema in the world. However, since 2008, the rapid conversion of the cinema exhibition industry to digital projection has seen 35mm film projectors removed from many projection rooms as they are replaced by digital projectors. As of the end of 2012, only about 30% of cinemas worldwide were still screening current release movies from 35mm film. The use of negative film for image capture continues to be popular in television, motion picture, and commercial shoots to this day. Eastman Kodak and ORWO continue to produce these films for its wide use in the motion picture industry. As of March 2013, Fujifilm ceased production of all motion picture film products with the exception of archival films. Early history. In 1880, George Eastman began to manufacture gelatin dry photographic plates in Rochester, New York. Along with W. H. Walker, Eastman invented a holder for a roll of picture-carrying gelatin layer-coated paper. Hannibal Goodwin's invention of nitrocellulose film base in 1887 was the first transparent, flexible film. Eastman's was the first major company, however, to mass-produce these components, when in 1889 Eastman realized that the dry gelatino-bromide emulsion could be coated onto this clear base, eliminating the paper. With the advent of flexible film, Thomas Alva Edison quickly set out on his invention, the kinetoscope, which was first shown at the Brooklyn Institute of Arts and Sciences on May 9, 1893. The kinetoscope was a film loop system intended for one-person viewing. Edison, along with assistant W. K. L. Dixon, followed that up with the kinetophone, which combined the kinetoscope with Edison's cylinder phonograph. Beginning in March 1892, Eastman and then, from April 1893 into 1896, New York's Blair Camera Company supplied Edison with film stock. At first Blair would supply only 40mm film stock that would be trimmed and perforated at the Edison lab to create 1/8-inch gauge film strips. Then at some point in 1894 or 1895, Blair began sending stock to Edison that was cut exactly to specification. Edison's aperture defined a single frame of film at 4 perforations high. Edison claimed exclusive patent rights to his design of 35mm motion picture film, with 4 sprocket holes per frame, forcing his only major filmmaking competitor, American Mutoscope and Biograph, to use a 68mm film that used friction feed, not sprocket holes, to move the film through the camera. A court judgment in March 1902 invalidated Edison's claim, allowing any producer or distributor to use the Edison 35mm film design without license. Filmmakers were already doing so in Britain and Europe, where Edison had failed to file patents. At the time, film stock was usually supplied unperforated and punched by the filmmaker to their standards with perforation equipment. A variation developed by the Lumiere brothers which used a single circular perforation on each side of the frame towards the middle of the horizontal axis. It was Edison's format, however, that became first the dominant standard and then the official standard of the newly formed Motion Picture Patents Company, a trust established by Edison, which agreed in 1909 to what would become the standard, 35mm gauge, with Edison perforations and a 1.33 aspect ratio. Scholar Paul C. Spoo describes the importance of these developments. The early acceptance of 35mm as a standard had momentous impact on the development and spread of cinema. The standard gauge made it possible for films to be shown in every country of the world. It provided a uniform, reliable and predictable format for production, distribution and exhibition of movies, facilitating the rapid spread and acceptance of the movies as a worldwide device for entertainment and communication. The film format was introduced into still photography as early as 1913 but first became popular with the launch of the Leica camera, created by Oskar Barnack in 1925. Amateur interest. The costly image-forming silver compounds in a film stock's emulsion meant from the start that 35mm filmmaking was to be an expensive hobby with a high barrier to entry for the public at large. Furthermore, the nitrocellulose film base of all early film stock was highly flammable, creating considerable risk for those not accustomed to the precautions necessary in its handling. The cost of film stock was directly proportional to its surface area, so a smaller film gauge for amateur use was the obvious path to affordability. The downside was that smaller images were less sharp and detailed, and because less light could be put through them in the finished film, the size of an acceptably bright projected image was also limited. Burt Akers was the first to attempt an amateur format, creating Burtak in 1898 by slitting the film into 17.5mm widths. By the early 1920s, several formats had successfully split the amateur home movies market away from 35mm, 28mm, 9.5mm, 16mm, and Path Rural, a 17.5mm format designed for safety film. Eastman Kodak 16mm format won the amateur market and is still widely in use today, mainly in the Super 16 variation, which remains popular with professional filmmakers. The 16mm size was specifically chosen to prevent third-party slitting, as it was easy to create 17.5mm stock from slitting 35mm stock in two. It also was the first major format to be released with only fireproof cellulose diacetate safety film base. This amateur market would be further diversified by the introduction of 8mm film in 1932, intended for amateur filmmaking and home movies. By law, 16mm and 8mm gauge stock had to be manufactured on safety stock. The effect of these gauges was to essentially make the 35mm gauge almost the exclusive province of professional filmmakers, a divide which mostly remains to this day. Still cameras. Just as the format was recognized as a standard in 1909, still film cameras were developed that took advantage of the 35mm format and allowed a large number of exposures for each length of film loaded into the camera. The frame size was increased to 24A, 36mm. Although the first design was patented as early as 1908, the first commercial 35mm camera was the 1913 Tourist Multiple, for movie and still photography, soon followed by the Simplex providing selection between full and half-frame format. Oskar Barnack built his prototype Leica in 1913 and had it patented, but Ernst Laetz did not decide to produce it before 1924. The first Leica camera to be fully standardized was the Leica Standard of 1932. How film works. Inside the photographic emulsion are millions of light-sensitive silver halide crystals. Each crystal is a compound of silver plus a halogen held together in a cubical arrangement by electrical attraction. When the crystal is struck with light, Free-moving silver ions build up a small collection of uncharged atoms. These small bits of silver, too small to even be visible under a microscope, are the beginning of a latent image. Developing chemicals use the latent image specs to build up density, an accumulation of enough metallic silver to create a visible image. The emulsion is attached to the film base with a transparent adhesive called the subbing layer. Below the base is an undercoat called the anti-halation backing, which usually contains absorber dyes or a thin layer of silver or carbon. Without this coating, bright points of light would penetrate the emulsion, reflect off the inner surface of the base, and re-expose the emulsion, creating a halo around these bright areas. The anti-halation backing can also serve to reduce static buildup, which was a significant problem with old black and white films. The film, which runs through the camera at 18 inches per second, could build up enough static electricity to cause a spark bright enough to expose the film. Anti-halation backing solved this problem. Color films have multiple layers of silver halide emulsion to separately record the red, green and blue thirds of the spectrum. For every silver halide grain there is a matching color cupola grain. The top layer of emulsion is sensitive to blue. Below it is a yellow filter layer to block blue light. And under that is a green sensitive layer followed by a red sensitive layer. Just as in black and white, the first step in color development converts exposed silver halide grains into metallic silver except that an equal amount of color dye will be formed as well. The color cupolas in the blue sensitive layer will form yellow dye during processing, the green layer will form magenta dye and the red layer will form cyan dye. A bleach step will convert the metallic silver back into silver halide, which is then removed along with the unexposed silver halide in the fixer and wash steps, leaving only color dyes. In the 1980s Eastman Kodak invented the T-grain, a synthetically manufactured silver halide grain that had a larger, flat surface area and allowed for greater light sensitivity in a smaller, thinner grain. Thus Kodak could solve the problem of higher speed which required larger grain and therefore more grainy images. With T-grain technology, Kodak refined the grain structure of all their EX, a line of motion picture film stocks. Fujifilms followed suit with their own grain innovation, the tabular grain in their SUFG Super F negative stocks, which are made up of thin hexagonal tabular grains. Other common types of photographic films, besides black and white and color negative films, there are black and white and color reversal films, which when developed create a positive image that is projectable. There are also films sensitive to non-visible wavelengths of light, such as infrared. Attributes. Color. Originally, film was a strip of cellulose nitride coated with black and white photographic emulsion. Early film pioneers, like D.W. Griffith, color-tinted or toned portions of their movies for dramatic impact, and by 1920, 80 to 90% of all films were tinted. The first successful natural color process was Britain's Kinetoscope, a two-color additive process that used a rotating disc with red and green filters in front of the camera lens and the projector lens. But any process that photographed and projected the colors sequentially was subject to color fringing around moving objects, and a general color flickering. In 1916, William Van Doren Kelly began developing Prisma, the first commercially viable American color process using 35mm film. Initially, like Kinetoscope, it photographed the color elements one after the other and projected the results by additive synthesis. Ultimately, Prisma was refined to be opaque photography, with two strips of film, one treated to be sensitive to red and the other not, running through the camera face to face. Each negative was printed on one surface of the same duplicitized print stock and each resulting series of black and white images was chemically toned to transform the silver into a monochrome color, either orange, red or blue-green, resulting in a two-sided, two-colored print that could be shown with any ordinary projector. This system of two-color bipack photography and two-sided prints was the basis for many later color processes, such as multicolor, Brewster color and Cinecolor. Although it had been available previously, color in Hollywood feature films first became truly practical from the studio's commercial perspective with the advent of Technicolor, whose main advantage was quality prints in less time than its competitors. In its earliest incarnations, Technicolor was another two-color system that could reproduce a range of reds, muted bluish greens, pinks, browns, tans and greys, but not real blues or yellows. Toll of the Sea, released in 1922, was the first film printed in the subtractive color system. Technicolor's camera photographed each pair of color-filtered frames simultaneously on one strip of black and white film by means of a beam splitter prism behind the camera lens. 2 prints on half-thickness stock were made from the negative, one from only the red-filtered frames, the other from the green-filtered frames. After development, the silver images on the prints were chemically toned to convert them into images of the approximately complementary colors. The 2 strips were then cemented together back to back, forming a single strip similar to duplicitized film. In 1928, Technicolor started making their prints by the imbibition process, which was mechanical rather than photographic and allowed the color components to be combined on the same side of the film. Using 2 matrix films bearing hardened gelatin relief images, thicker where the image was darker, aniline color dyes were transferred into the gelatin coating on a third, blank strip of film. Technicolor re-emerged as a 3-color process for cartoons in 1932 and live action in 1934. Using a different arrangement of a beam splitter cube and color filters behind the lens, the camera simultaneously exposed 3 individual strips of black and white film, each one recording 1/3 of the spectrum, which allowed virtually the entire spectrum of colors to be reproduced. A printing matrix with a hardened gelatin relief image was made from each negative, and the 3 matrices transferred color dyes into a blank film to create the print. 2 color processes, however, were far from extinct. In 1934, William T. Crispinell and Alan M. Gundelfinger revived the multi-color process under the company name Cinecolor. Cinecolor saw considerable use in animation and low-budget pictures, mainly because it cost much less than 3-color Technicolor. If color design was carefully managed, the lack of colors such as true green could pass unnoticed. Although Cinecolor used the same duplicitized stock as Prisma and multicolor, it had the advantage that its printing and processing methods yielded larger quantities of finished film in less time. In 1950 Kodak announced the first Eastman Color 35mm negative film that could record all 3 primary colors on the same strip of film. An improved version in 1952 was quickly adopted by Hollywood, making the use of 3-strip Technicolor cameras and Beerpack cameras obsolete in color cinematography. This monopack structure is made up of 3 separate emulsion layers, one sensitive to red light, one to green and one to blue. Safety film. Although Eastman Kodak had first introduced acetate-based film, it was far too brittle and prone to shrinkage, so the dangerously flammable nitrate-based cellulose films were generally used for motion picture camera and print films. In 1949 Kodak began replacing all nitrocellulose films with the safer, more robust cellulose triacetate-based safety films. In 1950 the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences awarded Kodak with the Scientific and Technical Academy Award for the safer triacetate stock. By 1952, all camera and projector films were triacetate-based. Most if not all film prints today are made from synthetic polyester safety base. The downside of polyester film is that it is extremely strong, and, in case of a fault, will stretch and not break potentially causing damage to the projector and ruining a fairly large stretch of film, to €3 ft or 2 seconds. Also, polyester film will melt if exposed to the projector lamp for too long. Original camera negative is still made on a triacetate base, and some intermediate films are also made on a triacetate base, as such films must be spliced during the negative assembly process, and the extant negative assembly process is solvent-based. Polyester films are not compatible with solvent-based assembly processes. Common formats. See List of film formats for a comprehensive table of known formats. Academy format. In the conventional motion picture format, frames are 4 perforations tall, with an aspect ratio of 1.375 to 1, 22 mm by 16 mm. This is a derivation of the aspect ratio and frame size designated by Thomas Edison at the dawn of motion pictures, which was an aspect ratio of 1.33 to 1. The first sound features were released in 1926 €27, and while Warner Brothers was using synchronized phonograph discs, Fox placed the soundtrack in an optical record directly on the film on a strip between the sprocket holes in the image frame. Sound on film was soon adopted by the other Hollywood studios, resulting in an almost square image ratio of 0.860 in by 0.820 in. By 1929, most movie studios had revamped this format using their own house aperture plate size to try to recreate the older screen ratio of 1.33 to 1. Furthermore, every theater chain had their own house aperture plate size in which the picture was projected. These sizes often did not match up even between theaters and studios owned by the same company, and therefore, uneven projection practices occurred. In November 1929, the Society of Motion Pictures Engineers set a standard aperture ratio of 0.800 in by 0.600 in. Known as the 1930 standard, studios which followed the suggested practice of marking their camera viewfinders for this ratio were Paramount Famous Lasky, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, United Artists, Pathé, Universal, RKO, Tiffany Stahl, Max Sennett, Dharma, and Educational. The Fox studio markings were the same width but allowed .04 in more height. In 1932, in refining this ratio, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences expanded upon this 1930 standard. The camera aperture became 22 mm by 16 mm, and the projected image would use an aperture plate size of 0.825 by 0.600 in, yielding an aspect ratio of 1.375 to 1. This became known as the Academy ratio, named so after them. Since the 1950s, the aspect ratio of some theatrically released motion picture films has been 1.851 or 2.351. The image area for TV transmission is slightly smaller than the full Academy ratio at 21 mm by 16 mm, an aspect ratio of 1.33 to 1. Hence, when the Academy ratio is referred to as having an aspect ratio of 1.33 to 1, it is done so mistakenly. Widescreen. The commonly used anamorphic format uses a similar 4x frame, but an anamorphic lens is used on the camera and projector to produce a wider image, today with an aspect ratio of about 2.391. The ratio was formerly 2.351 euro, and is still often mistakenly referred to as such euro until an SMPTE revision of projection standards in 1970. The image, as recorded on the negative and print, is horizontally compressed by a factor of 2. The unexpected success of the Cinerama widescreen process in 1952 led to a boom in film format innovations to compete with the growing audiences of television and the dwindling audiences in movie theaters. These processes could give theatergoers an experience that television could not at the time: Eurocolor, stereophonic sound and panoramic vision. Before the end of the year, 20th Century Fox had narrowly won a race to obtain an anamorphic optical system invented by Henri Creux, copyright 10, and soon began promoting the Cinemascope technology as early as the production phase. Looking for a similar alternative, other major studios hit upon a simpler, less expensive solution by April 1953, using a removable aperture plate in the film projector gate. The top and bottom of the frame could be cropped to create a wider aspect ratio. Paramount Studios began this trend with their aspect ratio of 1.66 to 1, first used in Shane, which was originally shot for Academy ratio. It was Universal Studios, however, with their May release of Thunder Bay that introduced the now standard 1.851 format to American audiences and brought attention to the industry the capability and low cost of equipping theaters for this transition. Other studios followed suit with aspect ratios of 1.751 up to 2:1. For a time, these various ratios were used by different studios in different productions, but by 1956, the aspect ratio of 1.85 to 1 became the standard U.S. format. These flat films are photographed with the full Academy frame, but are matted to obtain the wide aspect ratio. This standard, in some European nations, became 1.661 instead of 1.851, although some productions with predetermined American distributors compose for the latter to appeal to U.S. markets. In September 1953, 20th Century Fox debuted Cinemascope with their production of The Robe to great success. Cinemascope became the first marketable usage of an anamorphic widescreen process and became the basis for a host of formats, usually suffixed with scope, that were otherwise identical in specification, although sometimes inferior in optical quality. By the early 1960s, however, Panavision would eventually solve many of the Cinemascope lenses' technical limitations with their own lenses, and by 1967, Cinemascope was replaced by Panavision and other third-party manufacturers. The 1950s and 1960s saw many other novel processes using 35mm, such as Vistavision, Superscope, Technorama, and Techniscope, most of which ultimately became obsolete. Vistavision, however, would be revived decades later by Lucasfilm and other studios for special effects work, while a Superscope variant became the predecessor to the modern Super 35 format that is popular today. Super 35. The concept behind Super 35 originated with the Trzcinski brothers' Superscope format, particularly the Superscope 235 specification from 1956. In 1982, Joe Dunton revived the format for Dance Craze, and Technicolor soon marketed it under the name Super Techniscope before the industry settled on the name Super 35. The central driving idea behind the process is to return to shooting in the original silent Edison 1.331 full 4-perf negative area, and then crop the frame either from the bottom or the center to create a 2.40:1 aspect ratio with an area of 24 mm by 10 mm. Although this cropping may seem extreme, by expanding the negative area out perf to perf, Super 35 creates a 2.40:1 aspect ratio with an overall negative area of 240 square millimeters, only 9 mm less than the 1.851 crop of the Academy frame. The cropped frame is then converted at the intermediate stage to a 4-perf anamorphically squeezed print compatible with the anamorphic projection standard. This allows an anamorphic frame to be captured with non-anamorphic lenses, which are much more common. Up to 2000, once the film was photographed in Super 35, an optical printer was used to anamorphose the image. This optical step reduced the overall quality of the image and made Super 35 a controversial subject among cinematographers, many who preferred the higher image quality and frame negative area of anamorphic photography. With the advent of digital intermediates at the beginning of the 21st century, however, Super 35 photography has become even more popular, since everything could be done digitally, scanning the original 4-perf 1.331 picture and cropping it to the 2.391 frame already in computer, without anamorphosing stages, and also without creating an additional optical generation with increased grain. This process of creating the aspect ratio in the computer allows the studios to perform all post-production and editing of the movie in its original aspect and to then release the cropped version, while still having the original when necessary. 3-perf. The non-anamorphic widescreen ratios used in modern feature films makes inefficient use of the available image area on 35mm film using the standard 4-perf pulldown. The height of a 1.851 frame occupying only 65% of the distance between the frames. It is clear, therefore, that a change to a 3-perf pulldown would allow for a 25% reduction in film consumption whilst still accommodating the full 1.851 frame. Ever since the introduction of these widescreen formats in the 1950s, various film directors and cinematographers have argued in favor of the industry making such a change. The Canadian cinematographer Miklos Lent invented and patented a 3-perforation pull-down system which he called Trillant 35 in 1975, though he was unable to persuade the industry to adopt it. The idea was later taken up by the Swedish filmmaker Rune Eriksson, who was a strong advocate for the 3-perf system. Eriksson shot his 51st feature Pirates of the Lake in 1986 using Dupinaflex cameras modified to 3-perf pull-down and suggested that the industry could change over completely over the course of 10 years. However, the movie industry did not make the change mainly because it would have required the modification of the thousands of existing 35mm projectors in movie theaters all over the world. Whilst it would have been possible to shoot in 3perf and then convert to standard 4perf for release prints, the extra complications this would cause and the additional optical printing stage required made this an unattractive option at the time for most filmmakers. However, in television production, where compatibility with an installed base of 35mm film projectors is unnecessary, the 3perf format is sometimes used, giving the euro if used with Super 35 a euro the 16:9 ratio used by HDTV and reducing film usage by 25%. Because of 3perf's incompatibility with standard 4perf equipment, it can utilize the whole negative area between the perforations without worrying about compatibility with existing equipment. The Super 35 image area includes what would be the soundtrack area in a standard print. All 3perf negatives require optical or digital conversion to standard 4perf if a film print is desired, though 3perf can easily be transferred to video with little to no difficulty by modern TLC nor film scanners. With digital intermediate now a standard process for feature film post-production, 3perf is becoming increasingly popular for feature film productions which would otherwise be averse to an optical conversion stage. Vistavision. The Vistavision motion picture format was created in 1954 by Paramount Pictures to create a finer-grained negative and print for flat widescreen films. Similar to still photography, the format uses a camera running 35mm film horizontally instead of vertically through the camera, with frames that are 8 perforations long, resulting in a wider aspect ratio of 1.5 to 1 and greater detail, as more of the negative area is used per frame. This format is unprojectable in standard theaters and requires an optical step to reduce the image into the standard 4perf vertical 35mm frame. While the format was dormant by the early 1960s, the camera system was revived for visual effects by John Dykstra at Industrial Light and Magic, starting with Star Wars, as a way of reducing granularity in the optical printer by having increased original camera negative area at the point of image origination. Its usage has again declined since the dominance of computer-based visual effects, although it still sees limited utilization. Perforations. BH-perfs, film perforations were originally round holes cut into the side of the film, but as these perforations were subject to wear and deformation, the shape was changed to what is now called the Bell and Howell perforation, which has straight top and bottom edges and outward curving sides. The BH perforation's dimensions are 0.110 inches from the middle of the side curve to opposite top corner by 0.0730 inches in height. The BH 1866 perforation, or BH perforation with a pitch of 0.1866 inches, is the modern standard for negative and internegative films. KS perfs, because BH perfs have sharp corners, the repeated use of the film through intermittent movement projectors creates strain that can easily tear the perforations. Furthermore, they tended to shrink as the print slowly decayed. Therefore, larger perforations with a rectangular base and rounded corners were introduced by Kodak in 1924 to improve steadiness, registration, durability, and longevity. Known as Kodak Standard, they are 0.0780 inches high by 0.1100 inches wide. Their durability makes KS perfs the ideal choice for some intermediate and all-release prints, and original camera negatives which require special use, such as high-speed filming, but not for blue screen, front projection, rear projection, or matte work, as these specific applications demand the more accurate registration which is only possible with BH or DH perforations. The increased height also means that the image registration was considerably less accurate than BH perfs, which remains the standard for negatives. The Kansas, 1870 perforation, or KS perforation with a pitch of 0.1870 inches, is the modern standard for release prints. These two perforations have remained by far the most commonly used ones. BH perforations are also known as N and KS as P. The Bell and Howell perf remains the standard for camera negative films because of its perforation dimensions in comparison to most printers, thus it can keep a steady image compared to other perforations. DH perfs, the Double-Howell perforation was first proposed in 1932 to replace the two perfs with a single hybrid. The proposed standard was, like KS, rectangular with rounded corners and a width of 0.1100 inches, and, like BH, was 0.073 inches tall. This gave it longer projection life but also improved registration. One of its primary applications was usage in Technicolor's dye imbibition printing. The DH Perf never had broad uptake, and Kodak's introduction of monopack Eastman Color film in the 1950s reduced the demand for dye transfer, although the DH Perf persists in special application intermediate films to this day. CS Perfs. In 1953, the introduction of Cinemascope by Fox Studios required the creation of a different shape of perforation which was nearly square and smaller to provide space for 4 magnetic sound stripes for stereophonic and surround sound. These perfs are commonly referred to as Cinemascope or foxhole perfs. Their dimensions are 0.0780 in width by 0.0730 inches in height. Due to the size difference, CS Perfect film cannot be run through a projector with standard KS sprocket teeth, but KS prints can be run on sprockets with CS teeth. Shrunken film with KS prints that would normally be damaged in a projector with KS sprockets may sometimes be run far more gently through a projector with CS sprockets because of the smaller size of the teeth. Magnetic striped 35mm film became obsolete in the 1980s after the advent of Dolby Stereo. As a result, film with CS perfs is no longer manufactured. During continuous contact printing, the raw stock and the negative are placed next to one another around the sprocket wheel of the printer. The negative, which is the closer of the two to the sprocket wheel, must have a marginally shorter pitch between perforations. The raw stock has a long pitch. While cellulose nitrate and cellulose diacetate stocks used to shrink during processing slightly enough to have this difference naturally occur, modern safety stocks do not shrink at the same rate, and therefore negative stocks are perforated at a pitch of 0.2% shorter than print stock. Recent innovations in sound. 3 different digital soundtrack systems for 35mm cinema release prints were introduced during the 1990s. They are, Dolby Digital, which is stored between the perforations on the sound side. SDDS, stored in 2 redundant strips along the outside edges. And DTS, in which sound data is stored on separate compact discs synchronized by a timecode track on the film just to the right of the analog soundtrack and left of the frame. Because these soundtrack systems appear on different parts of the film, one movie can contain all of them, allowing broad distribution without regard for the sound system installed at individual theaters. The analog optical track technology has also changed. In the early years of the 21st century, distributors changed to using cyan dye optical soundtracks instead of applicated tracks, which use environmentally unfriendly chemicals to retain a silver soundtrack. Because traditional incandescent exciter lamps produce copious amounts of infrared light, and cyan tracks do not absorb infrared light, this change has required theaters to replace the incandescent exciter lamp with a complementary colored red LED or laser. These LED or laser exciters are backwards compatible with older tracks. The film Anything Else was the first to be released with only cyan tracks. To facilitate this changeover, intermediate prints known as high magenta prints were distributed. These prints used a silver plus dye soundtrack that were printed into the magenta dye layer. The advantage gained was an optical soundtrack, with low levels of sibilant distortion, on both types of sound heads. Modern 3D systems for theatrical 35mm presentation. The recent success of digitally projected 3D movies has led to a demand from some theater owners to be able to show these movies in 3D without incurring the high capital cost of installing digital projection equipment. To satisfy the demand, a number of new systems have recently been proposed for 3D systems based on 35mm film by Technicolor, Panavision and others. These systems are the latest version of the over-under stereo 3D prints first introduced in the 1960s. To be attractive to exhibitors, these schemes need to offer 3D films that can be projected by a standard 35mm cinema projector with minimal modification, and so they are based on the use of over-under film prints. In these prints a left-right pair of 2.391 non-anamorphic images are substituted for the 2.391 anamorphic image of a 2D scope print. The frame dimensions are based on those of the Techniscope 2 perf camera format used in the 1960s and 70s. However, when used for 3D, the left and right frames are pulled down together, thus the standard 4 perf pull-down is retained, minimizing the need for modifications to the projector or to long play systems. The linear speed of film through the projector and sound playback both remain exactly the same as in normal 2D operation. The Technicolor system uses the polarization of light to separate the left and right eye images, and for this they rent to exhibitors a combination splitter polarizer lens assembly which can be fitted to a lens turret in the same manner as an anamorphic lens. In contrast, the Panavision system uses a spectral comb filter system, but their combination splitter filter lens is physically similar to the Technicolor assembly and can be used in the same way. No other modifications are required to the projector for either system, though for the Technicolor system a silver screen is necessary, as it would be with polarized light digital 3D. Thus a program can readily include both 2D and 3D segments with only the lens needing to be changed between them. In June 2012, Panavision 3D systems for both 35mm film and digital projection were withdrawn from the market by DVPO theatrical, citing challenging global economic and 3D market conditions. Recent proposed innovations in pull-down specifications, due to extremely high cost of modern digital projection installations, a new projection system option, based on the proven 6 perf pull-down, first used in 3 strip Cinerama, is now being offered for low-cost film-based 3D stereoscopic presentations. It is also a means to provide a dramatic improvement in 2D 35mm brightness and resolution, approaching the look of 70mm, while still using automated 35mm projection technology. It is mainly intended for use in developing countries, and small, or isolated first world theater installations. Cost of prints are less than 25% of similar running time in conventional 70mm large format, and only about 10% of the cost of 3D of flat IMAX. Image is roughly 50% brighter and more detailed than for perf 35mm 3D or flat projection. As of mid-2010, only about 40 theaters in a huge film market, such as India, are able to show either digital 3D or 3D IMAX. As the duplication and film stock is compliant with SMPTE standards, there should be no impediment to its use, other than market forces, in the concerned countries and regions. Technical specifications. Technical specifications for 35mm film are standardized by SMPTE. 16 frames per foot per frame, 24 frames per second. 90 feet per minute. 1000 feet is about 11 minutes at 24 frames. Vertical pull-down, 4 perforations per frame, 35mm spherical, aspect ratio, 1.3751 on camera aperture. 1.851 and 1.661 are hard or soft matted over this, camera aperture, 0.866 by 0.630 in, projector aperture, 0.825 by 0.602 in, projector aperture, 0.825 by 0.497 in, projector aperture, 0.825 by 0.446 in, TV station aperture, 0.816 by 0.612 in, TV transmission, 0.792 by 0.594 in, TV safe action, 0.713 by 0.535 in. Corner radii, 0.143 in, TV safe titles, 0.630 by 0.475 in. Corner radii, 0.125 in, Super 35mm film, aspect ratio, 1.331 on 4 perf camera aperture, 0.980 inches by 0.735, picture used, 0.945 in by 0.394 in, picture used, 0.945 in by 0.430 in, picture used, 0.945 in by 0.511 in, 35mm anamorphic, aspect ratio 2.391, In a 1.191 frame with a 2A, horizontal anamorphosis, camera aperture, 0.866 in by 0.732 in, projector aperture, 0.825 in by 0.690 in. See also, 16mm film, Super 35, 35mm still photography film, 70mm film, color motion picture film, digital cinema, digital video, film perforations, film stock, history of the art and technique of making films, movie projector, original camera negative, still photography film formats, lists. List of film formats, list of motion picture film stocks, references. External links, American Widescreen Museum, Fujifilm Motion Picture Films, Kodak, Cinematography.